I want to begin so as to go backward through the recent past with Surrogates, a relatively recent 2009 film, and then from there to Universal Soldier from 1992. Surrogates in particular postulates, before the happy end occurs, postulates a future order of living with technology that suggests at the same time the stabilization of something like a delusion, the ability to relate to the body and to other bodies, not so much through technology. Technology is only materializing something like hallucination or delusion. So this need that is cultivated to interact through delusional order. You'll see that there are many ways in which the surrogate or double is plugged into human agents, ranging from the prosthesis. It's really a concise history of different relations with technological doubling. The Schreber moment comes when we realize that through the surrogate, one can interact with others, assuming any gender whatsoever, that it no longer becomes an issue. And the psycho-utopian moment in the science fiction would be, for example, that something like masturbation thus becomes perfectible as human sexuality. So with surrogates, we get a kind of cross-section of doubling fantasies that we reach today, I guess. Everything, I think, is pretty much included. The overriding contradiction or impasse is suggested by the title, which the film borrows from a graphic novel. I don't know why the title was first used, but of course we think of surrogate mothers, which is not what the surrogate is here, however, but which is denied by the surrogacy we see. What overrides this science fiction is a couple that is unable to mourn the loss of a child, and so they lose themselves in a kind of self-doubling that perhaps makes them younger versions of themselves, but these aren't fantasy choices in that sense. These are really instances of a kind of fortification so as to be able to survive the unacknowledgeable loss. And then, unhappily, at the end of the film, they are able to progress to a kind of successful mourning through the destruction of all the surrogates, which I think is a kind of mass murder. Especially since, in the beginning, as you'll see, one of the experts cited says that the surrogates, so they are prosthetic or prostheses, will, in time, develop a kind of existence. It may not be the same as human existence. So it's a very problematical film. I'm not showing you the beginning. I'm just telling you that it's the way in which it chooses to secure a so-called happy ending is difficult to watch. But I want us to see how techno-doubling is projected as a genealogy, as a history in this film. And then we'll look at Universal Soldier, which is really the best staging of Freud's introduction that I know of. So, okay, now, I tend to select films for which I don't have fixed reading, so this is really open now. As you saw in the opening genealogy, the robot begins, as did most media technical devices, as a prosthetic supplement for disadvantaged people. Typing was for the blind, and so on and so forth. And here, those who are paralyzed are offered the surrogate. Then the military cuts in, the culture industry, I guess. Once we get to the culture industry, we see that there are certain options. Closest to the crypt, as it were, the crypt that has to be flushed at the end of the film, for some version of a happy ending can take place. For them, the doubling is, in a sense, prosthetic too. They allow themselves the option of making the doubles younger, more together, but they're also recognizable as the doubles of the people who are separated over the loss of their son. But the culture industry, by and large, uses the surrogate so as to be able to interact, especially sexually, via the various possibilities that surrogate replacement would seem to make possible. As I said, it's a technologization of fantasy, possibly hallucination or delusion, but it's also the technological perfectibility of something like autoeroticism, which is technically, in the psychoanalytic sense, or pays tribute, in the psychoanalytic sense, to the pervasiveness of something called, in a value-free sense, perversion. In other words, anything that does not contribute to the order of reproduction is technically diverted from that and hence perverse, which is the option pursued here. Later on in the film, we see a TV advertisement selling surrogate children, for example. The bereaved mother turns it off immediately because she doesn't want to go there with the underlying meaning of the surrogate. I think one of the issues here, there are other issues, and I'm hoping that some of you will raise them. But one issue, as I said, would be the separate existence of the prosthetic double, raised by one of the experts in the opening genealogy, but it is paradoxically confirmed through this new weapon that is able to destroy the surrogate virally in such a way that the destruction reaches to the agent. This is a crisis in this the new surrogate order, which seems to be all about containing ruthlessness in the interpersonal or social realm. No longer is there the same sort of risk. Murder is down. The surrogate order is all about also the containment of a certain kind of violence. And an implementation at the same time of empathy. In this brief bit that we saw, the robot who takes care of the apartment building, who introduces us to the first murder victim, human murder victim, seems to suggest that there are also robots that are not attached to human operators. So we have a rather differentiated field of living through with technologization. Questions, remarks, associates? Yes, thank you.
Can you please speak to those individuals living in the outlands who refuse the surrogate identity?
Can you?
No, I don't think
It's interesting, of course, because it brings back a religious understanding of the human as dread. That's what the reservations are called in the film, dread reservations. But this doesn't neutralize everything, but it turns out that prophet is actually a surrogate being used by the inventor of surrogates, who now wants to take it all back again.
Who's a surrogate of a surrogate? The prophet with the dreads?
Yeah, he's a surrogate.
So he's kind of a shark.
Well, no, he's a robot. A robot being used by the very creator or father of these robotics, who wants to take it all away again. I mean, the distinction at the end of the film, which we didn't see, is between a complete destruction of both the surrogates and their operators, which is what this inventor has in mind, or what Bruce Willis is able to accomplish, the buffering or instant immunization of the operators, so they're not destroyed, but the total annihilation of all robots. Surrogates. Yeah?
Oh, sorry.
No, go on.
I had two things. First of all, in the, just as a point of interest in the comic book that it's based, I don't know if you've read the graphic novel. There's two sections to it, and one's sort of a prequel. And it has the concept is the same, and obviously the title and some of the plot points, but it goes through a very different, everything ends up very differently in the graphic novel, especially dealing with the prophet and the dread reservations. But what it does deal with is, in the backstory of the surrogates, there's sort of, and it sets up this distinction for the dreads, that there was this incident of, I don't think it's in the movie, this incident of kids who get a hold of their parents' surrogates and go out and kill a real person. There's the story about that. Yeah. So it's just really, brings, and it also deals with the racial issues. Like the movie, I think, does a lot with the gender issues, but and there's a little section where somebody is like actually black and has a white surrogate. But in the graphic novel, it really dives into that. And so we should just go ahead. The other thing, what is really interesting to me about the whole idea is what you touched on this, where the Bruce Willis character and his wife, they have recognizable surrogates. They're sort of new and improved and younger, but they still look like them. And it always sort of, the direction I wanted it to take was sort of the idea, and it goes into this with the military, the scene where he's talking to the military guys. But there's, they have a certain, sort of lower grade surrogates that look less and less like humans, but they still are based on sort of the humanoid model, whereas they don't really go into whether or not, you have a surrogate completely operating like a tank, or a car, there's still surrogates getting into cars, rather than just like connecting to the car. Do you know what I mean? And so they don't really take it away from from recognizably human things. And it makes me wonder why they don't. Like, what is it about that double that it has to still be it can look like almost anything, but it still has to be sort of recognizably human.
Sort of connected to how I felt, or some thoughts I had about the fact that it has to be limited to a double, and that it can't actually have a multiplicity.
Well, there's actually a character in the movie who has it.
Well, more than one surrogate, or have some sort of card connection.
Well, it's certainly a clunky late arrival of stuff that, was available as cyberspace and stuff in the 90s. Now you have actual robots. That's why I chose it, though, because it's more continuous with Metropolis and the earlier science fictions. Because here what's underscored is the doubling relationship as a relationship, which can be instrumentalized all down the line throughout society. And as such, it's really not on the side of affirmation, obviously, but underscores perhaps already existing perceptions of the culture industry. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, how do they address with, or how's it explained, rather, with that virus? Because I know that's sort of like the typical kind of theme of, the Ross and Universal Robots, sort of the RUR style thing of, they created, in, the Matrix, and then there's another element, obviously, digital realm and all that. But, so it's a virus that's then spread through...
That's how they describe it. I don't really know why
it's
virus, but that's how it is. It's a blast of some viral infection that is so instant and total. That the damage it does to the surrogate is so total.
But it's not being directed by some surrogate. It's it's not like a weird, a surrogate acting against the agents in some weird way, through the system. It's just a virus.
No, it's an accident. I don't know how it is in the graphic novel, but in this film, it was developed by the military as the gun to use against enemy surrogates, I would assume. And it was with the limited aim of destroying the surrogate completely, beyond repair. But when they discovered that it went all the way, thereby undermining the whole order of surrogacy, they tried to withdraw it from circulation. But then one model escapes, and the story follows.
I have a quick question. Did you say car body? A surrogate car? I am. Whether or not you did, in talking about the question of surrogacy and non-human actors, or having a surrogate that it doesn't resemble a humanoid situation, this idea of car, it made me go back to that opening scene, the very first kind of construction that we have of this individual, we don't know if he's a surrogate or not, inside of a car, talking to a father. There's there's a unvisualized, visualizable body of the father that's in this car space. It made me think that it would be really interesting to look at Roland Barthes' analysis of the space of the car, kind of in a genealogy of intimate, customizable spaces. He talks about the movement from the Gothic cathedral to the car to the Walkman as these thresholds of the individual's ability to assert their agency on on an aesthetic, architectural, technologies of the self kind of thing. I'm not articulating it perfectly, but what inhabits all three of these spaces is the idea that of the sonic and of a sound. It's something that maybe there's been an aural phantom since the beginning invocation of Hitler's understanding of a decoupling that occurs between print media and the cinema. It raised the question for me of the question of voices, the question of the decoupling that also occurred in techno-mediated space between the human body and the ability for the human body to be displaced from the body with the advent of sound recording technologies. It'd just be there's another decoupling there that I think would be curious to raise and would involve looking at a history of sound theorization, whether or not there's another non-visual, non-localizable decoupling happening, or a series of decouplings happening.
In so many languages, when we refer to autos, we also refer to the self.
Mm-hmm.
So that will justify a return to the car to rebreathe it.
There's a whole thing about car sex also, and autophilia and anger.
Well, this brings us to adolescence.
Yeah, taking it for a testes drive.
I would assume I'm probably not the only one here thinking about what we've just seen here, beyond the Hollywood tropes and cliches of what it's doing, but about what we talked about with Hegel yesterday, the master and the servant, the Tolstoy. This is a pretty literal rendition of the same tale. And I would have to assume at some point that we have another movie that Bruce Willis, the real man, is saved somehow by his machine or something. Maybe.
Sorry.
Yeah.
The surrogates aren't allowed to become master. Well, no, they're completely wiped out.
They're completely wiped out.
Yes.
Even this prophet
Yes,
character.
yes.
Okay.
It's an entire restart
So
for humanity.
there's like a technophobia happening.
Oh, absolutely. Because it's. But would you like to go anywhere with that? I mean, that doesn't mean anything. This could be the denial of the dialectic.
That's true.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, just kind of a little beyond thinking, yes, we are all expecting this coming, the closer our iPhone is to our brain, this is...
Well, how about going there? I mean, at some level, I think the film operates not as a forecast, but as a restaging of what's already there.
Well, absolutely. I mean, what was it? You said it. The biomedical to the military complex to the culture industry. I mean, that's just process over. That's how we have everything that we have right now, virtually, pretty much.
And the choice is to be inside adolescence, technologization, mass psychologization of adolescent being, which is also a way, of course, of neutralizing adolescence. That's why the focus is on creating a completely safe, risk-free space. So adolescence is both technologized and made available, but it's made available so that that which is premature and insightful and turbulent in adolescence, for better or worse, is also not an option. And what's recognizable is that for this adolescent or group psychology to be put forward, we have to, this isn't the most interesting part of the film, but we have to have recognizable stars. And that's also why Bruce Willis can't choose an otherwise unrecognizable teenager. There's a scene where he has that option, he just can't do it. Because in order to re-enter this culture industry, we are invited to seek out and recognize certain figures, and that's what Hollywood stardom accomplishes over and over again. Mike Kelly in the 90s pursued a piece that was also a kind of recommendation or diagnosis. He argued that all the personalities, identifiable personalities that were on display anyway, whether in the music or film industry, had to be placed into the service of satisfying us sexually, whether literally or via syndications like the surrogate industry. that was the complete unfolding of their meaning and their role. In some removed sense, in other words, that was happening anyway, but less efficiently. So what is accomplished through this kind of technologization of adolescence? One aspect of the adolescent bond, which is the neutralization of difference through likability. Likability extends, of course, to the cute exterior, but also being like. So there is that moment to adolescent socialization where one might say that the adolescent likes to be different like everyone he would like to be like. So that one aspect is lifted out of adolescence and turned into the bond that is served up over and over again by the culture industry, or this culture industry in the film, in any event, where it is made either inscrutable or legible by the clunky inclusion of robots or surrogates. In any event, it does bring us to the border of the domestication of a space that, let's say, before World War I, was still considered to be in the outer limits of psychosis. Here we see how, through technologization and the attendant group or mass psychologization, those features that had otherwise been excluded as unthinkable or untreatable are more and more being placed into the foreground of socialization itself. I stopped short and was more interested earlier in thinking about how that was implemented step by step in the rewiring of the soldier psyche to his new technologies and functions. So with that, I'd like to go to Universal Soldier, which is precisely about war neurosis and its afterlife. Just from the beginning, please. As you saw, almost the complete picture. Everything is duplicated from the scene of the trauma. The war ego also recommences his earlier behavior, and the film takes place as this repetition compulsion. And the woman, the reporter who was introduced, also accidentally finds herself in the position of the scene onto which the PC ego keeps on flashing back. He protects her, and that adds a dimension that builds up to a happy end. In any event, what's most interesting for our purposes is the way this film shows clearly how at the moment of impasse, in other words, the two soldiers in Vietnam miscarry their duties or whatever, to the point of mutual suicide, and it's another kind of impasse. And out of this, however, military psychology and its technological abilities chooses to select the material for a universal efficient soldier that is then used many years later, taken out of the context of Vietnam, used many years later to contain terrorism, for example. And yet what is also carried forward here is the backfire of that very motor that is being applied. So the doubling conflict between the two soldiers is what is used in order to build the efficient soldier, which is a building not only up to greater powers and prowesses, but between the lines, I would say, also used towards the creation of a new psychic frontier that makes them also psychically adapted to the military venture. And yet, in this film, in any event, we're reminded of this war neurosis through the backfire of the implementation. As a flashback, as it were, the trauma in this picture is not overcome. But we know, within the larger picture, that while it's true, no war to date has been able to neutralize war neurosis, or post-traumatic stress disorder, as we call it now, which underwent a great many different framings and integrations in the course of the wars following World War I. Still, the truth, as it were, that the film foregrounds for us, genealogically speaking, is that it's out of this doubling conflict that after World War I, inside psychoanalysis and outside, one began to project the efficient soldier, who was also a kind of sci-fi pioneer, if we could just remove the unpleasant context and consequences of war. This figure genealogically serves also as a kind of pioneer in the colonization, as it were, of psychotic states for a new form of adaptability that, of course, is not always necessarily restricted to warfare, nor does it have to reduce itself to the kind of culture industry we saw in Surrogates. But between these extremes, it is Freud's essay on war neurosis, the introduction to the understanding of war neurosis, is in some sense the opening of a legibility of certain changes that have already gone down. To stick to clinical work, of course, this switch, this change, is documented in the diagnosis, which had been unheard of, would have been unheard of earlier, of the borderline. Increasingly, not only in diagnosis and treatment, but also in the ways in which we interact with each other and with and through technology. We find ourselves, if we were to think about it, on the border with psychosis, which had at one point, and perhaps still misleadingly, tends to be projected as the borderline where no treatment or understanding can reach. But in the context of Psy-fi, we come to the realization that in fact this is the area wherein a kind of new norm began to be established following World War I. So from that new norm, we'll be looking more closely at Freud's earlier reading of Schreber, and I'd like to look again at the end of the introduction to psychoanalysis and the war neuroses, where one sees beyond the, let's call them opportunistic fringe benefits that psychoanalysis received in the course of World War I, where Freud announces the theoretical openings, therapeutic openings made possible at this time. Okay, so if we could just return for a moment for the sake of a continuity shot to Introduction to Psychoanalysis and the War Neuroses. I'd like to finish off, as it were, its introductory potential for us now. There are two aspects I haven't really addressed yet. One would be the way in which Freud sets up the receiving area of resistance, even as he notes that psychoanalysis is suddenly circulating widely. I think it's instructive to follow in 207 and 208 how he really uses the resistance to introduce this new reading of War Neuroses. So, for example, some of the factors which psychoanalysis had recognized and described long before as being at work in peacetime neuroses, psychogenic origin of the symptoms, the importance of unconscious instinctual impulses, the part played in dealing with mental conflicts by the primary gain from being ill, flight into illness, were observed to be present equally in the war neuroses and were accepted almost universally. But he warns us not to think that this represents a real reconciliation. Further down on 208, this other portion of psychoanalytic theory with which the study of war neuroses did not come into contact is to the effect that the motive forces which are expressed in the formation of symptoms are sexual, and that neuroses arise from a conflict between the ego and the sexual instincts which it repudiates. But the opponents of psychoanalysis, whose dislike of sexuality is evidently stronger than their logic, have been in a hurry to proclaim that the investigation of the war neuroses has finally disproved this portion of psychoanalytic theory. They've been guilty here of a slight confusion that the investigation of the war neuroses, and a very superficial one at that, has not shown that the sexual theory of the neuroses is correct. That is something very different from its showing that the theory, that theory is incorrect. So he addresses the split in the reception, one half resistance, one half acceptance, as reflecting the exceptional status of war neurosis, which had been reserved for it in peacetime only by the traumatic neuroses. Traumatic neuroses were or psychosomatic or psychological consequences that followed from something like a train accident, an accident in the mine, some kind of catastrophic incident that was registered also psychologically. Because of its compact picture, it seemed to fall by the wayside of Freud's original interpretation of neuroses in terms of their sexual ideology. This has to be filled out a little more thoroughly because the notion of traumatic neurosis was also almost immediately accepted by all the social institutions that count, perhaps because in its compactness it seemed to belie the original Freudian theory. The very institution of insurance, which was relatively new in Germany, we tend to credit Bismarck with having introduced health and especially accident insurance. Various people have interpreted this in terms of Bismarck's wily attempt to disrupt class conflict and to introduce in its stead a relationship to the other via risk that insurance supplies. Anyway, right from the start, insurance calculated the psychological consequences of accident. So this is a separately invested portion of the large picture of psychoanalytic research at that time, which was accepted more readily as I've said, as the reading of shell shock, the management of shell shock, was also more readily accepted up to a certain point. Now, Freud says that this reflects his working hypothesis of a distinction between the transference neuroses and the narcissistic neuroses, which reflects a use and understanding of narcissism prior to around 1914 or so. In any event, this is how Freud first named the distinction between the neuroses proper and the psychoses. All along, early on, at the time when psychoanalysis bracketed out psychosis, treating psychosis as an absolute boundary concept, barely theorizable, barely theorizable, but certainly untreatable. It is into this divide that traumatic neurosis too, to some extent, but especially war neurosis, because of the attention attracted to it in the context of war, would now lead to an unsettling of that formerly rigid distinction. And as he writes on page 209, towards the bottom of the page, it only became possible to extend the libido theory to the narcissistic neuroses after the concept of a narcissistic libido had been put forward and applied. A concept, that is, of an amount of sexual energy attached to the ego itself and finding satisfaction in the ego, just as satisfaction is usually found only in objects. This entirely legitimate development of the concept of sexuality promises to accomplish as much for the severer neuroses and for the psychoses as can be expected of a theory which is feeling its way forwards on an empirical basis. So it coincides then, as I already mentioned, but here you have it again, it coincides with the encounter with shell shock or war neurosis, is this period of deregulation of Freud's theorization that has already admitted a rethinking of narcissism that has welcomed ego psychology, or a certain focus on the ego, alongside the border between conscious and unconscious thought. And thus, this is his announcement of new frontiers, as now opens up the psychoses or the narcissistic neuroses to further understanding, possibly treatment, in any event. The line now a true borderline drawn between neurosis and psychosis, and drawn through psychosis itself as the possibility, yes, even of transferential treatment and legibility begins to open wide on this once discarded turf. So, having said that, I showed the clip, the opening of the film, Universal Soldier, as a kind of example of what Freud was writing about in 1918, 1919. And I wanted to ask if there were now any responses to the film. We had to pull away very quickly after I'd shown the clip. I know you wanted to ask something.
Well, something that I didn't allow myself to have time to think through during our break, but that appeared to me in a kind of a blur that maybe we can put some language around, was the intense homophobia of the military-industrial complex. And it's kind of maybe a surface, just cliched reading of the different kind of co-imbricated points points of impasse that served as I don't know how you would say it, like a boundary, a limit experience within oneself as a soldier, as a male-bodied individual, in kind of in
Which scene specifically what is coming through the most?
So I saw it in like the accelerating to hyperbolic parody of the violence in that dual suicide Harry Carey, like adolescent encountering the male that I like in the representations of what both of those soldiers and their power roles, like reading a power dynamic onto each other in the confrontation with each other and the turning towards one another. But then there was somewhere else. There was another scene where it came up again and it like recapitulated a kind of this idea for me. But talk amongst yourselves. I'll try to figure out what that was. I don't know.
Yes.
I had another comment that's unrelated to that topic.
Good.
But we'll definitely come back to it if other people want to. But I just, when watching the film, I just immediately could not help but think of RoboCop and how much of a direct kind of quotation it was of RoboCop, this idea of the man dying and then being replaced by a machine that still is man with human memories that start to somehow take over the projection of the machine. But I thought it was really interesting that RoboCop, I mean the original RoboCop was made in the 80s, was pretty much limited to local threats, domestic threats. It was a policeman that's becoming a robot, and it seems like now when was this film made? Maybe 2 years ago?
Did I say 92? 92.
Oh, really? That changes a lot of things. Okay. Well, it's still an interesting shift, and I was thinking that it happened post 9/11, post sort of Iraq War. But I mean, again, that's something to question: how the shift suddenly took place from this very local, civil threat, and the response to that in terms of how the state might want to act in the face of threats and what the threat actually is. So in the 80s, it's local kind of police force that needs to be reacting, and then I guess by 92, I thought it was much later. It's gone. The same story, the same idea has now been transferred to the military.
Well, I haven't looked at RoboCop for a while now, but
Oh, you should. It's amazing.
no, I know. But I have short-term memory loss when it comes to film. But I seem to recall, though, what's central there, among other things, is the prohibition against killing commanding figures, which is also borrowed, of course, from Asimov, for example, the notion of the law of robotics. It has to be introduced once we are no longer replicating the body, but or start replicating the mind. But I seem to recall that at that point of crisis, where RoboCop can't proceed any further, there is a kind of governmental authority behind his agency. So he's kind of up in tilt.
Sure, there is the bigger man coming in, definitely, in terms of the bigger of the state, not on a civil level. But
And that film was also much more concerned with a difference between the cyborg and the shear robot, I guess, or the shear machine. In a very interesting note notion of a kind of evolutionary loop that couldn't be broken by progress. That's one scene that I can't forget, where the shear machine falls over on its back and can't move like an infant.
The stairs, yeah.
Rendered powerless.
Right, but his strength then becomes his weakness. There's this sort of Hamletian moment where he's confronted with the desire of the woman who replaces the lost one. And it becomes an interesting reflection on mourning within a trajectory that includes literary references. Here there's nothing to the film but the trauma-fixated soldiers. Through that scene, which travels, on occasion a few new people get included in the repetition. So it's a little hard to compare the two, other than the cyborg feature of potentiating a dead or undead body and the limits that one runs up against in the course of that. Yeah.
The figure of the ear collector.
Excuse me?
The guy that collects the ears.
Yes.
Well, first made me think that it seems that the opposite of the war neurotic, of the post-trauma disorder, in the sense that he's not the one that shies away from the combat, but
Right.
is the one that sees the enemy everywhere.
Right.
But it also seems like a recurrent figure in, I mean, I think at least of Heart of Darkness from Kondra,
Of course.
or Apocalypse Now, also this figure.
Right. Well, I'm sorry if that was if I presented that poorly, but I'm arguing that through the almost mindless repetition, we are invited to read this as a psychic event, the conflict between the two soldiers, and I was rather literally, allegorically, reading the soldier who wants to go home as the peace ego, and the one with the ears as the war ego, which would motivate the extremity of especially the one position.
In the development of the film, the people that operate their scopic realities, because I noticed that as they were moving through, did he not say, don't focus on the dead bodies? So there's a conscious management of their memories, and there's an awareness that we don't want to bring them back to the site of trauma. Does that develop? Do they become aware?
I don't remember that.
Remember, there was I could have been imagining.
Oh, when they're cleaning up
When they're
afterwards.
cleaning up,
Oh,
right?
Sorry.
Don't give them the horror. They
Right.
can't handle it. There's still a shred of their former selves intact. So does the film lead to a point where they feel like they can kind of manage that in a psychoanalytic way,
Or a therapeutic way?
Yeah.
No, it becomes unmanageable because you can't destroy this conflict.
Right.
Every time the peace ego thinks that he's given the other one the slip, he returns despite all the destruction.
And even if they were to divide them and put them on different missions, there would still be the internal.
Because they now share that fixity
Yeah.
at this point. And so the therapeutic figures are all killed off by the war ego in the course of the film. He takes over the apparatus for a single-minded pursuit. You were talking earlier about I don't know if this is the time to bring this in, about new research.
Yeah. No, I mean, we all are aware of it. We mentioned it. Katerine Malibu had done some research on neurobiology of the mind and how trauma fundamentally creates a new self, so that revisiting the site of the trauma, some people might put forward, is not even able to be libidinally reconstituted into the former self of the traumatic self. So it's like a full. It's not a divided self. It's a new self, right? So I don't know how it fits into this genre exactly, or if it does, but it would lead one to think of a very haunting image of a purely sort of reproducible machinic, where there's nothing behind, and you can just always be going forward into violence and so on. So, but I don't think that this has been explored in this particular.
Well, not in this film. No, I mean, the film, for whatever reason of its own, wants to suggest that the the scene to which both flashback can't be escaped.
Right.
And yet, some of the research I was referring to earlier, the military psychological research, for example, shares certainly the desire or fantasy that trauma would not hold one back, but is the occasion for a kind of mutation, which is what I was talking about.
Mutation?
Yeah, so that the psyche or the norm and psychic reality would undergo a change to such a degree that trauma would no longer mean the same thing, for example. But other than the aspiration, which is always being implemented in military research or other kinds of research too, I suppose, I don't know of any proof that one is able to how shall I put it? Start over from scratch. That you're rather than being stuck in the scratch of the
Even with the advent of virtual warfare, you would think that in the terrain of virtual warfare, the potential mediation and interventions into reconfigurations of distancing and proximity that one has to the abstract site of the violence they inflicted, which doesn't really exist. Yeah. So it could be in that space whereby the person pressing the button is able to escape from the cycle, as it were.
But I would almost say that maybe that distance could make it even more traumatic, because then you're still sort of in your everyday life, and you realize that through this mediated distance you have inflicted harm or been involved in this traumatic event, whereas I think if you're there, you can, in certain ways, separate it and say, I was over there, and there were certain threats while I was over there. You know, maybe that's not the case, but at least I think there's possible reading that it could almost be more traumatic.
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah, the sort of young guys that fly drones, pardon me, out of Las Vegas, over Afghanistan actually suffered the same levels of trauma as actual fighter pilots.
after a delay.
I'm not sure. They sort of, but they sort of go to their job, they bomb Afghanistan, and they go home and have dinner, but they sort of still suffer the same trauma as normal pilots do.
Well, this, of course, the flashback is to Vietnam, and it was as a result of Vietnam. I don't know whether it was formulated on that occasion, but it became the lasting term in the post-traumatic stress disorder, because the U.S. military thought that they had finally cheated war neuroses by introducing this notion of the tour of duty. That comes up in the clip too. He says, "Come on, the year is up," whatever he says, "we can go home now." That was new with the Vietnam War. You knew that there was a limited period of time, and then you would go home. And during the war, there was no war neuroses. But then, after a certain delay, the people back home were become survivalists and reenacting the war over and over again. So that reintroduced this notion of the delay, or underscored the notion of the delay in the development of traumatic symptoms.
But it was actually not the military that decided, wasn't it intensive lobbying efforts, and there were institutions that arose that advocated for it.
I mean, it could be a convergence of influences and interests, but ever since World War I, all the military establishments have been very much interested in curtailing war neurosis. In the Korean War, the notion of the buddy system was introduced, open to contain the stress that way, but then of course when the buddy was kicked. There are, I mean, you could go through the history of these more recent wars
But
and
now
see
we-
different models.
Yes, but now we have an over-medicalization of PTSD. For example, I have several Marine friends, and it's always like, oh, come on, don't be a pussy. Do you really have it, right? I experienced the same thing as you, and you're going to get off easy, as it were. So it creates this kind of, this internalized oppression that people put on themselves, like, was it enough? Was my experience eligible for it, and so on, because it is extremely over-prescribed. And I'm sure there's a number of institutional arrangements and partnerships with private medical groups that are profiting from that, and so on. But I wonder if you, maybe not now, but at some point I'd love to see the genealogy of that through military and through war, and maybe your thoughts on where that's headed.
Well, this goes back to Isaac's statement about the hyper-masculinity.
Yeah, exactly.
He said, quote, don't be a pussy.
Exactly.
I mean, that's like this mentality of,
Yeah.
we're going to go bomb some shit. Come on, dude.
This is what we do.
Super man.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's anything to do. I don't think it's over the way.
But the difference is that the people that are getting it were not, tended not to be the ones at the front lines. There's the people that were more removed that received the PTSD. But there's a kind of valorization and making heroic of those who actually fought, and they are sometimes immune from being medicalized and taking the pills for it. It's a very interesting phenomenon.
I mean, it affects everyone.
Yeah, I would argue that it does, yeah.
I was also wondering, suppose the movie that I always think of when I think of like different like war neuroses and how people end up dealing with this sort of really traumatic situation, Thin Red Line. In that, there's like this sort of like all of these really distinct ways of everyone dealing with it. Whether it's like creating these sort of like fantasy kind of characters of like this person back home who's no longer going to be with you and like living only in that before that. But then like the people who have a full world collapse and completely have lost it, and then the ones who somehow manage to like still see the beauty in all of it. And so like I know that was World War II, I guess. So it was before we were talking about this, but like how would like say the peace ego and the war ego then in like the thing, how would that kind of come through in that movie? How could you see that? Is it, I mean, I suppose that each of them have like just those different blurred like parts of it, and some people have more of the war ego who then deal with it. I don't understand, it seems so much more complicated then. It's really clear in like the robotic sort of way with these two.
Right.
But
Well, because they inhabit an impasse,
right.
which is what illustrates Freud's breathing. But as I said before, out of that diagram of the impasse, people saw the possibility of all sorts of redosing, recombining of the basic elements, so that one could also scatter it, for example, or otherwise. Well, I'm not as familiar with that film as I would need to be to answer this adequately. But just in general, in terms of this fixity is perfect as an illustration of Freud's reading of the incapacitating aspect of shell shock. But one could allow it to spread out genealogically, of course, because that's what happened in the development of what this notion contained, the possibility of manipulations, so as to induce trauma or to promote a kind of immunity against traumatization. One model for trauma, of course, comes up in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. It's one of the notions, or one of the portions that Benjamin borrows and refers to in some motifs in Baudelaire. And that is in terms of the repetition, the flashing back of the soldiers. He's still thinking about World War I soldiers. And he is perplexed that, or voices anyone's confusion, that the soldiers would always be dreaming of the traumatic event that runs counter to common sense, perhaps, and certainly to Freud's understanding of how the pleasure principle organizes every dream thought. And then, among many other things that he is inspired to think about because of this counter-evidence, he suggests that it's in the repetition itself, the repetition of the traumatic impact, as it were, in a funny kind of memory. That's why we call this kind of memory flashback. It's in this repetition that the original defenses that were blasted away can begin to be reassembled. This is the part that interested Benjamin. Freud speaks about anxiety as our mode of preparedness. So our first and last defense is anxiety itself, and it's when that is breached that we have this incapacitating trauma that produces, at the time, these symptom pictures.
It's like a repetition in order to be able to overcome.
Yeah, he doesn't really say, but it's the repetition itself is supposed to restart over time the anxiety. Anyway, I just mentioned that because you had talked about these other speculations that argue for a separation from the traumatic event itself, in the consideration of its impact, but also of its treatment, I guess, or its non-treatment.
I'm just wondering, when you say that the repetition itself, you start seeing it right, and you're saying that the repetition ultimately degrades it? The anxiety, or?
No, it's supposed to bring it back.
So I think about that, Kierkegaard's repetition.
Absolutely. Freud is very close to Kierkegaard at this point in his writing.
There was that amazing thing where he speaks about, I went back to each place to try and recognize repetition, to try and repeat, couldn't do it,
Absolutely.
And realized that it's almost like the lack of repetition is the repetition.
It's as I think he puts it, remembering in reverse. So I mean, repetition, which seems at first a kind of forgetting, yet harbors memory, which is another way of talking about this anxiety I'm talking about.
Right, and the repetition, those who don't recognize repetition as a medium, the medium of life are they're going to be condemned to perish, or something like they'll be condemned to their own will just to perish anyways. It's insidious and circular. So it perpetuates the anxiety.
So for our purposes, in contemplating Psy-fi, we're not really going to go into beyond the pleasure principle. I just mentioned that because this has come up. But we're going to consider ways, new ways, that psychoanalysis, for example, also stages, new ways in which we sought to encounter trauma. To give this general talk right now. This will climax, as we will see tomorrow, in Freud's essay on fetishism, I will argue, in the way in which he uses dissociation to put forward a relationship to trauma and a new sense of doubling that is, as psychoanalysis would say, ego-syntonic, capable of being sustained in a stabilizing way. But before we get there, it's important to see that the introduction to psychoanalysis and the war neuroses postulates not only a conflict within the ego, but in a sense, theoretically, what have you, internalizes the conflict of the war. This internalization is related, in a sense, to the technologization, the forces of technologization evident in this first total war, too. So already in the theory, and this then gets demonstrated in its indications by other researchers, in the theory Freud is already performing a kind of techno-internalization of the trauma of war, so as to make it available to understanding, but also to treatment. Remember, he is going with the notion of psychoanalysis, knows how to understand and treat shell shock. The first treatment is this move into the ego, which is already an internalizing move. It is compatible with processes of technologization.
Is there in this discussion, and I think it's built a little bit on what Isaac was saying, is have there been interesting conversations or interesting study about gender or women or any other people that live on the planet in relation to the traumatized soldier, other than a reactive mode? I'm just wondering if there has been a place, because that is the world in which the traumatized soldier lives, is full of other people, and studies that are not sort of like are reactive to this, but that are interesting to talk about. Like, so other, the other people that live in the world are not just objects that are kind of reacting to this norm, this total norm that we see constantly, and it really is valorized in film. But I don't want to talk about it in a way that's, boring.
Well, I'll take a risk. But the first thing that one would have to say is that by the time of World War II, at least, I happen to remember the texts that would support that. It's not just the soldier who's undergoing a kind of mutation, as it were, but the family, the wife, whatever, whoever receives him when he comes back is also being, that whole milieu is being rewired. This was actively contemplated by American psychoanalysts and psychologists from the military, but also civilians, in the last years of the war. And I would argue that family systems therapy that was so dominant after World War II is a kind of reflection of that. Now we can speak of families as systems, and I think it was the soldier first who, upon his return, made necessary a thinking of the family in terms of system, in terms of each person's situation in that system, and so on. I don't mean that the language itself reflects this, but it certainly suggests that the family, that's what family systems therapy is all about. It's no longer the individual whose psyche is being addressed, but the family as a psyche suddenly becomes available for treatment and understanding. It depends what that family consists of. It's just the couple, and that would be couples therapy. All of which doesn't just come in to address crisis, but is considered, or was certainly introduced at the time as something that was preventive, that was not only going out to meet the symptom, but going out to meet the system as the symptom so as to anticipate it, prevent it in a certain sense. All I'm saying in answer to your very good question is that the soldier had to be the symptomatizing soldier. And the Americans were probably the first to do this. Didn't have to be, but they took it as the opportunity or the occasion to introduce changes into how we think about the family itself or the couple relation, so as to accommodate whatever changes he was bringing home. I suppose that's still reactive.
Yes, it's very reactive. I don't know how to make it not reactive, but it seems to me that there should be a way, because if there's a mutation that goes on, then the rest of society is mutating, but it's all, it's always around this traumatized, individual, and that seems like the kingpin for every system.
But,
and in the corporate world now as well, I feel like that's the model, and that's what, there's so much poetry about that, and, Batman, it's just, there's just so much of it that's just not including anyone else as the primary driver of any kind of dynamic.
Another way to address this, though, would be to remember that the first patients, the first vehicles for psychoanalytic discovery were all women. It was only with traumatic neurosis that one began to postulate that men could be hysterics too. So really men were brought in later. It's always women and children first. And in science fiction too, please consider the history that's perhaps begins in the 18th century or so. But one gets the sense leading up through Metropolis that in the case of Schreber, that the woman's body is the body that gets technologized first. That's where the mutation first occurs. Through shell shock, men were clicked. So that would be another way. Not beyond the activity, but just the same. Yeah?
Does the notion of deferred action make it difficult to then try to treat these symptoms in advance? Because after that last time takes place, you can't predict how the meaning will change in that gap of time between the trauma and the reoccurrence of that.
There's always experimental tries to do precisely that, to anticipate that which will arrive after a deferral. But as far as I can tell, nothing has been successful.
In another way, I'll arrive after a deferral and say that the scene that I was thinking about in the beginning of class was when the scientist, individual character, the remote viewers of the combat in the present incarnation of the movie are watching the soldiers, and the kind of lackey says, oh my God, it seems like he's starting to, he could be starting to like this. And the scientist says, oh, well, don't be ridiculous. Because it's exactly that. The question of the neutralization of our ability, our desire to like what we might like what we might be able to like, or want to become, that is the site that's kind of, I thought was being configured there, which has, so it became a question for me of the adolescent scene, and then the dismissal, the phobia of what the implications would be of liking what one likes. In this kind of, in the way that it reverberates with the violence that we saw in the kind of the primal hereditary situation. So that was my other scene.
It's interesting too that it seems like in the movie, like on the other side of death, almost the trauma is inverted, and it becomes the only site that they can reclaim themselves. So they have, as cyborgs, control over themselves. but at the site of the trauma, like that's kind of where they're located instead of where the other is located inside of them.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why the experiment fails. Whoever was responsible for this program simply selected particularly psychopathic individuals paying attention to the scene of the conflict for rewiring as killer machines. Yeah, but there was an inner world to these psychopaths, which they both shaped. You can't shake it.